Welcome to Peace and Power Ukraine, a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. Ukraine sits at the crossroads of modern history where East meets West and freedom collides with totalitarianism. I am excited to have another great episode with you today as we wonder about what this peace plan that's been brought forward by the Trump administration might look like. Will it lead to actual concrete negotiations? How will the Ukrainians respond? We'll know a lot more in coming days. We're also going to discuss how much the energy fight is impacting Russia and also Ukraine. We're going to unpack the corruption scandal here in Ukraine and how that's being dealt with and addressed. We have so many important topics, and today I'm glad to be joined by Liliane Bivings. And you are an editor at the Kyiv Independent covering business and politics and economics. And it's so great to have you here with us, Liliane.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be
All right.
here today.
Well, I want to have a conversation about the important policy topics, but I think it's important just to tell our audience, how did you end up in Ukraine? Why are you here?
Yeah, I think it's a good story for the audience because it's a very classic story, I think, an American story in a way. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. So I came here in 2017 as a Peace Corps volunteer. For the listeners who don't know what that is, it's an American government-led volunteer program that sends volunteers all over the world to teach English, work with children, work with communities. And just, it's kind of a funny story. In 2016, I traveled to Russia just because I was there for a couple of weeks. I liked it. I was looking where there were programs, Peace Corps programs. I saw that there was one in Ukraine. Knowing nothing about this region at the time, I thought, well, I enjoyed Russia, you know. It's very embarrassing now, but you know what? I'm honest about it. I came to Ukraine in 2017 to teach English. Basically fell in love with the country immediately, like within months, and decided I was going to stay here for, I guess forever and build my career here. And then I very accidentally became a journalist, and then the full-scale invasion started, and of course, it really felt like it was my duty to stay here and be here and report on it.
So you said yes to journalism and yes to Ukraine, and then the full-scale invasion happened.
Yes.
So there's already a lot to cover with all that was happening since 2014. So that was of interest, but now it's, literally you have war and peace and death and destruction, sad news, but very important news to cover. You're in the center of all world affairs, really meeting at Ukraine.
And a lot of transformation, like the amount of transformation, like you said, after 2014, there was a lot happening. And then there was COVID, of course, right? So there was this constant rapid transformation in Ukraine all the time. And then the full-scale invasion happens. And you're right, there's all this tragedy and sadness. And it's just enormously difficult what is happening in Ukraine and what has happened to the Ukrainian people from 2014, but of course on a larger scale from 2022. But you've also had so many examples of people rising up, people defending their country, defending freedom, defending their right to exist, getting together and staying in the country, just like the Kyiv Independent. We existed for 3 months before the full-scale invasion started. We were a small media startup. And then the full-scale invasion started, and everybody stayed in Ukraine to continue reporting on the war from the ground. The president stayed, even though, he's in trouble right now. He did stay, his team stayed. And you've had, of course, like technological advancements in defense tech that have just changed probably the course of world history. And you've had just even living in Kyiv, like you see that despite all of the destruction and all of the horror, people are developing, they're moving, cafes, restaurants, bars are opening up, new businesses are starting, people are doing all of these things. And it's just like a beautiful example, I think, of humanity.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to describe it. It's partly why I've also fallen in love with this city and this country. I want to dig into some of the headlines now that you have been covering as an editor there. I know you've delved into this corruption scandal. A lot of our friends in the West would say, hey, this just completely fits with all of our concerns. This fills our presuppositions about Ukraine. But what I see more of, and I can comment on this, is I think the glass is half full. That sunlight has come, transparency is happening, and corruption's being rooted out. So I see it a little bit more positively, but help us understand it from your perspective on the ground here, because I'm sure there's many cuts of this onion.
Yeah, I think you're right, definitely. Or I would agree that it's people shining a light on these things, and that's a good thing. And actually, there's a sort of a saying or a common wisdom in the anti-corruption activist scene in Ukraine, which is that the reason that you know so much about corruption in Ukraine is because anti-corruption activists talk about it more than anyone. Like it's not because there's so much corruption. It's because the people who want it to change talk about it all the time. They expose it, they talk about it, they discuss it. They want the world to know that these things are happening. Not just other Ukrainians, but the world, to help, so that the world can, help them change, push them to change, right? So it's not that more corruption exists in Ukraine than it does elsewhere. In any other, I mean, there are many countries in which this is a systemic problem, especially developing countries. Ukraine is really young. It's just barely 34 years old, just barely 35, I guess. And 10 years of its history have been war. 10 years of its independence, have been war. You have the 1990s, which are extremely difficult after the fall of the Soviet Union. And you have a revolution in the early 2000s. And in 2013, 2014, you have a revolution, then war, then this full-scale invasion. It's extremely difficult for a country to develop properly in those circumstances. So the corruption is a result of that. And I kind of put it this way. It's a bit of like this fight of like good against evil constantly. So you have people in Ukraine who are working tirelessly to make the country a better place and fighting and dying for the country to exist and move forward. And then you always have the people who are sort of hell-bent on making sure that it doesn't change, that it remains a place that's easy to steal from, to take advantage of. And it's a struggle between those people, I think.
Is it going back to like the Soviet mindset that's pulling them back in? Or is it more just, corruption happens everywhere, but Soviet corruption was a different type of corruption, you think?
Yeah, I have actually thought about this a lot recently. Like, are the people who experienced the Soviet Union traumatized in some way by that experience, and traumatized by the fall of the Soviet Union, which was a very difficult experience. Imagine everything that you know just disappears basically in one day, and around you is total economic despair. And it's all about protecting yourself and surviving in these really difficult circumstances. So in the Soviet Union, surviving and making sure you and your family were okay was very important. And then you go into the 90s, which are very difficult. And so you have a bunch of people who are thinking about themselves in a way to survive, basically, right? And so they have this mentality, it's not everybody, but some people, right? That, well, everything is terrible. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that me, myself, and I, and my family, and my friends are taken care of. Because, because you never know what happens tomorrow. So I might as well sort of get what I can get here, maybe buy myself an apartment in Vienna, in case all hell really breaks loose here and I have to leave forever, So it's that mentality. It's a mentality of people who have been through a lot, right? And have been maybe even traumatized. Now, I brought this up with other people, and they'll say to me, that's no excuse for their behavior. It's not. It's not an excuse, and it's not an excuse for adults to be stealing hundreds of millions of dollars, right? That they were traumatized as children. Okay, but it perhaps is one of the reasons, that you see this type of behavior.
Now connect this corruption scandal to the energy challenges. So we have this moment where we're facing another challenging winter, and of all the areas for the corruption to have come up, it's in the energy sector. So how difficult is that for the people to see and know that some of what they're facing right now with rolling blackouts is because of this corruption in this area? Does that compound the problem, at least politically, and how the people are reacting?
Yeah, I think people are rightfully so devastated and just besides themselves that, given the situation in the energy sector, given Russia's relentless attacks and worsening attacks on Ukraine's energy system year after year, that people would be stealing from that very sector. But the story is kind of, it's a very complicated one, because this corruption scandal was happening almost exclusively at Energoatom, which is Ukraine's nuclear energy state-owned company. And because of the full-scale invasion and this variety of factors and this almost perfect storm, this state-owned company all of a sudden has a ton of money. It's a monopoly in the energy sector because of all of the destruction. It becomes very important. It becomes crucial as an energy source because, of course, thankfully, Russia's not launching missiles and drones directly at nuclear plants because that would obviously be, not that I would
nearby.
Put that, right? Well,
certainly nearby.
It attacks the infrastructure that connects it to the grid, but it doesn't hit the plants itself. Thankfully, and knock on wood. And so that sector had been sort of insulated from some of these attacks. There's a lot of money going into it because, of course, it's a monopoly in the energy sector now because of all the destruction. And it's also kind of getting some leeway because it's the nuclear sector. It's very fragile, sensitive. We don't want to go and start investigating corruption, or giving them a hard time about their corporate governance because, one of their plants, the largest in Europe, in Zaporizhzhia, is occupied. There's Chernobyl, which is, of course, one of the worst tragedies, basically, of the 20th century. So people sort of turned a blind eye to what was going on inside of Energoatom, this state-owned nuclear energy company. And all of those things
made it ripe
for these people to
scandal.
Right. And so I think that's kind of getting a bit lost in all the noise, is that it's this very kind of specific example that is related to the energy sector, yes, of course, because it created the conditions for it to happen there, but it's kind of separate. Right. In terms of the reaction from people, I can't say that Ukrainians are very surprised, unfortunately.
So tell me, from your perspective at the Kyiv Independent, will the people see the resignation of the two justice ministers as enough, or will the people demand that it goes further up the chain and that there are others that need to be held culpable?
I think that for civil society and people who really pay attention to this to be satisfied with a response that they feel really, matches the crimes. People even like Zelensky's chief of staff, the head of the presidential office, Andriy Yermak, would have to be replaced. But as we found out just yesterday, on Thursday, Zelensky is not getting rid of Yermak. He's not going to make him resign or fire him or replace him, which I was expecting. Zelensky, he's really he's not just Zelensky's right-hand man, he's his right arm,
So the people also wouldn't be surprised by that at this stage.
I don't think so. But I think, people are happy to see that at least Halushenko, who, by the way, Herman Halushenko, who was the former energy minister, but then was moved to justice minister, and Svetlana Hrenchuk, who was the current energy minister until recently, who was apparently Halushenko's girlfriend, or, maybe not girlfriend, but they had relations of that nature, that at least they were forced to resign. I think it's a good sign. Okay. But Ukrainians also know that sometimes ministers resign and they sort of appear somewhere else. But I will say the last thing is that I think Ukrainians seeing this anti-corruption process from the anti-corruption agencies, they see it as a good sign, right? That those agencies are working.
Right. So we've talked about corruption. We've talked about energy. Let's move into peace negotiations. We have on the table now, this recording, a 28-point peace plan that in large part Stephen Witkoff brought forward from the Trump administration. Maybe Secretary Rubio also supports it. Maybe not wholeheartedly, but somewhat. There's different signals out there. So how is the government initially imbibing this particular proposal, beginning the digestion process? What has been said, and what do you forecast for these coming weeks, if you can begin to make an educated forecast?
Yeah, so I think the first reflection is that Ukrainians are just so exhausted by every few months or so. It seems to be the same story. All of a sudden, there's news reports that there's a peace plan. And then versions of it start getting leaked.
Right. It's the boy who cried wolf story.
Totally, right? And then it's the US is putting pressure on usually Ukraine, always Ukraine, and then it's going to cut intel and military supplies if it doesn't, abide. And then everybody goes into panic mode. Lots of things being, leaked and reported from different sources. Zelensky, starts coming out with statements about whether or not he will support this or not, or why this is not acceptable to Ukrainians. Usually we get that kind of thing. So everybody has this sort of whiplash and kind of almost trauma from having these experiences. And then they die because they die out and then nothing happens, right? This one feels a little different. We were talking about this in the newsroom today. We thought this one feels different. Why? Well, the first thing is that you have the largest corruption scandal of Zelensky's administration unfolding. I mean, the news of that broke less than 2 weeks ago, right? You have an energy crisis. I mean, there's blackouts for half a day in a lot of the country. You have, obviously, the economy is doing poorly. And then the situation on the battlefield is really rapidly deteriorating. I mean, I think it's maybe the worst it's been in a long time or ever. So maybe there is more of an appetite of the Zelensky administration to finally negotiate something, because you don't see the same kind of messaging or signaling from Zelensky and his team that this is unacceptable to us. There
was even one statement already that the majority of this is workable.
Exactly, which is different and new. Right. So there's that, and you start to wonder, okay, and then you have the current head of the National Security Council, Ukraine's National Security Council, Umerov, who was the former defense minister, who is likely a part of this corruption investigation. They haven't sort of announced anything formally about him, but everybody assumes that he's also under investigation. And he was in the United States, and everyone thought for a second maybe he was fleeing, but he was in Miami, and then he sort of negotiates with Trump people some new changes to the peace plan, which is also kind of a signal that, okay, they had a guy in the US doing some serious kind of negotiating on certain points. Who knows, though? It could all fall apart again.
Right.
Right. There are some different
By the
signals.
time you're listening to this audience, it could have all fallen apart again, or we could be at a significant new stage. But I do think you're right. This does feel different. I also think it's interesting from a U.S. perspective that this is coming out only days after we heard for the first time that U.S. ATACMS missiles had been used to fire long range into Russia. Right. That was brand new and had been waiting to happen for years almost. And then immediately, Trump proves he's willing to do this. Let me get a peace plan out there.
Right.
Because he's got a MAGA base that is not going to be happy about him, with the missiles and that leverage. And they're not going to necessarily be happy about U.S. security guarantees in said document. Right. Then you also might have a United States Senate where maybe this isn't as strong as they would like also. And then you have European leaders who are completely left out. So there's still many camps that are going to weigh in and impact all of this.
Absolutely. And I think the Europeans are going to do all that they can in the coming days to alter or stop or alter or have some effect on this plan. Because one thing that gets left out of the conversation, in general, because it's so much between the US, Russia, and Ukraine, is Europe. And Europeans also could do more, I think, to make themselves heard in these conversations. But the peace plan, as we've seen it in leaked reports, is really bad for Europe. I mean, there's this one specific piece of it that someone pointed out to me just today, which is that NATO and Russia would negotiate on security, because of course this is one of Russia's complaints, that NATO is infringing upon its security, which of course we know is not the case at all. And that the U.S. would act as a mediator, which implies somehow that the U.S. has removed itself from NATO, right? Which is very scary for Europe, but I think for Western sort of security order, it's not a good sign that the U.S. is seeing itself as somehow outside. So I think the Europeans are probably also very much in panic mode.
Isn't it fair, though, to assume that any clause like that should only be viewed for a 3-year segment? Because Trump's there for 3 more years. After that, that type of provision could be drastically different, whether there's somebody who follows in Trump's footsteps or someone from the Democratic side. That would look very different. Europe would have to know that a lot of these things being discussed could change. But that's also part of the deep problem in all of this, that once there isn't Trump in the picture, they have to have a peace that can last many years beyond, or else the Ukrainian people will be back in the same situation in just a few years.
I absolutely agree. And I think the Europeans need to kind of get out of the paradigm that they were in for so long, which was that, the NATO was led by the U.S. and they deferred to the U.S. in making large, sort of big security decisions, right? Whether it was going to war or where they were going to make decisions on various security priorities. And they need to learn how to operate in a world in which that leader is not there. It's not in the room anymore. And you can't wait around for that person to make any decisions. And in fact, they might be making decisions at the moment that are actually contrary to your security.
Right.
And you might have to kind of wake up and realize we might need our own architecture here that is independent of anyone but the European Union or continent, right?
So, Liliane of the Kyiv Independent, let me give you a Kyiv Independent question.
Yes.
Who's winning this war?
That's a great question and a hard one to answer at this moment.
Based on the factors you laid out a little bit ago, it would sound like you would say Ukraine is not winning this war.
They're not winning, but Russia's not winning either. If you look at the thing that I remind myself of every day is if you look at what Russia has managed to take in the last couple of years, it's mere kilometers.
It's a snail's pace.
Right.
It really is.
And I remind myself all the time, if you just look at the size of Russia on the map relative to the size of Ukraine, it is so brutally embarrassing that Russia, and thank God Russia wasn't able to do it, right? I love Ukraine so much. I'm so happy. But I mean, theoretically speaking, a country so large with so many more resources than Ukraine. And yes, Ukraine has received a lot of help, but still couldn't manage to invade the country.
Well, let me phrase it a little bit differently. Does Putin have a plan for victory?
Absolutely not.
That's why he's at the table, right?
I think
he needs an exit strategy.
He does, and because he needs
to
present
have a story that he can present to his people.
Yes, and I don't think he has that yet, though.
No, Ukraine has to give him some story to tell, but also have a peace with dignity. That's what I heard recently when I had a discussion with Majority Leader David Arkamia. He said there has to be dignity. This is an important concept to the Ukrainian people.
Of course.
This idea of dignity. I don't think a U.S. audience really is familiar with that word, even uses it anymore. It almost sounds like, oh, that's a civil rights era word that you only read about in the history books of the 1960s. We don't talk about dignity very much. What does that mean to you and to the Ukrainian people? Yeah,
I think it's a great point to make that for Ukrainians who have fought and died in the revolution in 2013, 2014, 100 people were killed, were shot in the streets by the security forces of the former president. And in this war, tens of thousands of people have died since 2014 to now. And for Ukrainians, it's very important that these efforts were not in vain also. So it's about dignity, but it's also it's connected to this idea of dignity that I did not do this for nothing. We did not do this for nothing. So if it ends poorly, not in the way we would really want it to, it needs to end in a way that does not make all of this feel like totally in vain. That like people that we love didn't die for no reason, right? Because you see that has a really, I think, difficult effect on society. And Ukrainians already have struggled to really believe, you may have heard that there's this thing called the inferiority complex that Ukrainians have, that they've been made to feel less than Westerners, less than Russians. They're always the smaller culture, society, people. And they've done a lot of work, I think, on themselves to get out of that paradigm, right? To believe in themselves. And they've done a lot to show the world that we are worth a lot, you know? And so if the world tells them, actually, no one really cares, and all of those efforts, you know, we're going to break up your country, we're going to leave it on its own, would just be so painful in the moment and also traumatic long term, and also bad for the world, for at least the West long term, right? To have a broken Ukraine would just be so bad for everyone, right? It would be bad for Europe. It would be bad for the West. It would be a victory for Russia to leave Ukraine that way.
As we close out, if there's one thing that you want to leave our audience with that we didn't get to discuss today, what might that be?
Wow, these are all the things that are occupying my mind all the time.
Besides subscribing to the Kyiv Independent.
Of course, subscribe or donate. But, you know, one thing that I always make a point of now when I talk to people from the US or from the Western world or just anywhere abroad is that we actually, as Westerners, have really ignored Ukraine for too long, and we know so little about Ukraine and Ukraine's contributions to world history, but also to the world nowadays. And I always tell this story.
And Ukraine, Kyiv, pre-existed Moscow.
Also, by the way.
Something little like that.
Exactly. But even really modern things, like I was at a party in New York after the full-scale invasion had started, and somebody was criticizing aid to Ukraine. They were inebriated and sort of came over to me to tell me that, you know, this is sort of nonsense, supporting this country, blah, blah, blah. And I tried every argument to convince this person that it was worth it, and nothing was working. And I finally said, well, you know, Ukrainians have contributed a lot to like technology. They're a part of our, you know, of our Western world and the things that we use. I said, for example, did you know that WhatsApp was invented by a Ukrainian? And she said, no, it wasn't. And so people have such sort of, people know Ukraine so little that they think it's almost impossible, right? Because in their minds, Ukraine is like some, I don't know, farm country in Eastern Europe, you know.
It only feeds the world.
Right? No, exactly. I mean, there's that. And then one of the founders of PayPal was Ukrainian. One of the founders of Revolut, this, you know, fintech company, was Ukrainian. You know, like we actually did an article, which is 10 companies you didn't know had Ukrainian roots. And like, it's shocking, I think, to people to find out that all of these technologies that you use every day were invented by people who were born and raised in this country. And if you let this country go, think of all the future technologies and innovations that you might be also letting go.
Well, that is a great final point. Where can our listeners follow you on X or other places?
Yes, so obviously on the Kyiv Independent website, on X, on LinkedIn, and then also I have a weekly business newsletter called the Ukraine Business Roundup.
And spell your last name.
Yes, so Liliane, Liliane, and my last name is Bivings, Bivings.
All right, great. Well, we hope that our listeners and all those viewing on YouTube will find you and follow your important work. And we are so glad to bring you another episode here from Kyiv. And please like and subscribe and do all those wonderful things that you do to keep up with us. We're going to have many more episodes in coming weeks right here from Kyiv, telling the stories on the ground. So thank you so much for being with us for this great conversation. See you next time.